Oh, I did that. We always do that with the mute thing. Let me try that again. Good morning to everybody, wherever you may, or good afternoon and good evening to everyone, wherever you may be in the world. My name is Uzodinma Iweala, and I'm the CEO of the Africa Center. And I'd like to welcome you all today to our program on African climate and energy in the media that we've put together in partnership with our friends, the Energy for Growth Hub. So just a little bit of background. This is the third in a series of programs that our organizations have collaborated together on. And we've done this because we found that there's a lot of common ground in our respective climate and energy focused missions. With that, we've thought there's a real opportunity to bring the thoughts of the energy and policy community together with the focus of the Africa Center's emphasis on narratives and culture, and really put together a very enriching discussion about some of the issues that cut across many, many aspects of our lives. So today we're joined by three very special guests who are going to bring their experience and their expertise as journalists covering the African climate scene and energy stories as well. To help us better understand some of the major points of debate in this space, especially around how the continent's climate change and energy access are covered. I just want to say a couple words, though, before I introduce them, just about where we are in this fight against climate change as a planet, and of course, as Africans or diaspora people. That's one, and then of course, about the energy transition that's being talked about in the news more than ever before. That move from fossil fuels to alternative or renewable forms of energy. Look, we all agree that this is a really good thing, but the issue that sometimes comes up is how this transition is being talked about, and of course, how the continent is talked about when it comes to climate change. And one of the things that we're really interested in both at the Energy for Growth Hub and at the Africa Center is the challenge that journalists face in reporting on climate and energy issues in Africa. Basically figuring out how to balance the responsibility to faithfully and accurately inform the public about the numerous important and often technically challenging issues that come up with climate change, with energy transformation or transition, but also to balance that against journalistic imperatives, to tell compelling stories. Journalists don't just write, they write to interest people, to make sure that people are paying attention to the important issues of the day. And so what we're interested in is how do we prevent this entire discourse around climate and Africa from crystallizing into a few just simplistic bullet points or overused narratives, instead of bringing in all these different perspectives from the continent. How do we make sure that we're not focusing only on external voices? And so what we're trying to do here today with our friends, with Energy for Growth Hub, and also with our expert panelists, is really think about that and engage with how journalists highlight some of the issues central to the climate crisis and the dilemma, of course, around reporting on it in Africa. How do they capture attention without resorting to tired narratives? How do they convey facts and not be sensational, but also convey the urgency of the situation in which we face? How do people stay away from sort of the tired narratives around vulnerability? And then how do we tackle the continent of Africa's changing role in global climate politics? So to answer all those questions today, we're joined by Josiane Kouagheu, Tim McDonnell, and Samuel Ajala. I'll introduce each of them really briefly, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Josiane is an award-winning journalist based in Cameroon who's covered multiple things, including civil war, human rights abuses, and health issues for a number of publications like Le Monde, Afrique, Reuters, and others. She's currently a fellow of the Rainforest Investigations Network at the Pulitzer Center, which conducts investigative reporting on cross-border collaboration to tackle climate change, corruption, and governance in the world's main tropical rainforest regions. And she was also a member of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and worked on global investigations on a number of things, including the Pandora Papers. We also have Tim McDonnell, who's the senior climate and energy reporter at the global business magazine Quartz. He's covered science, politics, and business around climate change for more than a decade from 4 different continents. He's actually in Cairo right now. He's based out of Cairo and reporting on climate change along the Nile Delta. and he'll be at COP, which will be his third COP. So excited to have him. And Samuel, who is a data and development journalist covering Nigeria's climate change, energy transition, and WASH, among a number of other things. He's a 2022 Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue Media Fellow and Future News Worldwide Delegate. He's a contributor at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Germany and also works as a freelance journalist for a number of publications in Nigeria, including Data Fight, Adweek, All Africa, and The Nation, as well as Premium Times. So with that said, I'm really excited to have our friends on with us. And let's just get into some of the questions. I'd really like to start with all of you. I think we've got everybody on screen now, great. Just to set the current scene for climate and energy journalism across Africa. So let me just ask a general question to you all first, which is, how would you characterize the state of environmental or climate or energy journalism on the continent of Africa at this present moment? Let me start with Josiane.
Sorry, I lost you. Can you repeat, sir?
Okay, so I was just saying, when you think about climate journalism on the continent, how would you characterize the way that people are currently reporting, writing about climate in Africa?
I think he does not yet occupy the place of political or sport journalism, but there are more and more media and especially journalists who are specializing in it. In Cameroon, even if they are not enough, they are present at the same time. Climate change and environment challenge are more and more present. We have flood, we have drought, we have deforestation. The population are suffering and they see what is happening. And even if some of them do not necessarily make the link between deforestation and droughts and others, they are facing the consequences of climate change. And then some journalists are trying to report on it now in Cameroon.
Thank you, Josiane. So, it sounds like that people are just making those links. And I know that, Josiane has some network issues, hence her camera being off, but we'll see if that can be resolved. But so people are just starting to make the links. And let me ask you, Samuel, you're between Nigeria and Germany. Are you noticing a similar thing?
Sorry, can you take that again?
I was just asking, so Josiane just said that people are beginning to notice that there's a growing interest, especially from journalists. And I was asking, from your perspective, between Nigeria, Germany, are you noticing a similar thing?
Yeah, it's not really a similar thing, if I would say. Yeah, when you tend to compare the state of climate journalism in Nigeria and Germany together, yeah, because the truth remains that here, in Africa, our people are still new to the topic of, climate change. And the media is actually doing its best to ensure that, our people are more enlightened to know more about climate change. Yeah, because when you look around everywhere in Africa, you will get to understand that, climate change is real because a lot of things are happening at the moment. And even in Nigeria at the moment, we're having issues with flooding, yeah, in different parts of the country. And there's a lot more of work that needs to be done, yeah, to ensure that, people get to, understand more about climate change in Africa.
And so let me just push a little bit. And so what do you think is pushing sort of this change in public interest? I mean, you mentioned, and Josiane mentioned this idea of people see things in the environment around them, the floods in Nigeria most recently, for example. What is do you see a direct correlation then?
Yeah, I would really say, what is actually, pushing all these is because people are now seeing, the impact and effect of climate change in their environment. Yeah, it's actually visible, and it's getting them to become more interested. Yeah, in in the public discourse of climate change.
Right. And Tim, let me turn to you. You've been at this for 10 plus years. And when people talk about the continent of Africa, I think we're all very aware here that the continent, African countries, African people in general have not really contributed anything to the current set of emissions or the emissions and outputs that we've seen, nor to the temperature rise that we're seeing. So that's kind of like a standard thing. But the question I have for you is, we say that. Has it really changed the way that people recognizing that, changed the way that people cover some of these issues and stories, especially vis-a-vis the continent?
Yeah, it's a great question, Uzo. Thank you. And by the way, I just wanted to say thanks very much for including me on the panel. The Energy for Growth Hub especially has been super helpful for my reporting over the years, and I'm really grateful for all of the research that they do, and so really happy to be joining this great group this afternoon. And I wanted to add too to the kind of previous question about changing perceptions among the public about climate change, as far as how journalists are engaging with this topic here, and news audiences in Egypt. I really noticed that for Egypt, especially in the run up to COP27, that this has really become a big business story. And we do see these stories and coverage about kind of climate change impacts, the traditional things that people have focused on, droughts and sea level rise here on the Mediterranean, for example. But one of the other big storylines that we've started to see a lot more of, and I've been writing about this myself, and other people are kind of covering here, local Egyptian newspapers covering a lot more, is clean energy as an investment opportunity, the business kind of ecosystem that is evolving around energy writ large, including the natural gas industry and solar and wind and green hydrogen. And there's sort of this whole universe of energy stories that are and kind of climate related businesses that are popping up in Egypt. And that's sort of the tenor that a lot of this is taking, is where people are finding those kinds of opportunities, and it's become kind of a business story in that sense. There's a great newsletter that I subscribe to for Egyptian business coverage called Enterprise, which I invite everyone to also subscribe to. They do a great job, but they actually just a couple of weeks ago launched a whole new edition of their newsletter that's specifically climate focused, and they're pulling in kind of climate related business stories from Egypt and all over the North Africa and Middle East. And they do a really great job of rounding some of that news up. So just to say that, we are seeing, of course, more of these climate change impacts here, and that is getting more coverage. Although I agree with what other panelists have said, that for a lot of people, I think there's still is a little bit of a kind of disconnect between, effects, environmental effects that they might experience, like for example, in the agriculture sector, and connecting that to kind of the greenhouse gas emissions of ExxonMobil, for example, or other, emitters in the Western world. That there's still a bit of a disconnect there, but I think in terms of seeing a sort of business story or business opportunity and solar and wind and climate adaptation. And I had a story this week about startups that are launching like smartphone apps to help farmers deal with climate impacts and improve their access to markets. And there's a sort of tech ecosystem that's evolving around that. So I think that whole piece of it is really blowing up quickly in the media and getting a lot more attention here. I'm not sure if I answered the question that you actually asked. I was sorry about that.
I think it's a good context set, and I actually want to take that and go back to Josiane and to Samuel as well. So, Josiane, are you seeing similar stories pop up in both of what you cover and what you see in the journalistic environment in Cameroon or across Francophone African countries or French-speaking African countries?
I would like to first set the context in Cameroon. In Cameroon, domestic energy consumption for cooking consists of about 80% of firewood. I mean, population Cameroonian use 80% of Cameroonian use firewood. 30% use charcoal. It means that in Cameroon, now the vast majority of Cameroonian households still use fossil fuel like charcoal and firewood. You know, it's not easy for in Cameroon, they did not yet realize that, I mean, not every Cameroonian, not everybody, but the vast majority of them are still using firewood or charcoal. And you have a few people who are using, you have some people who are using green energy like green charcoal. You also have it in Cameroon. But it's not yet like in Egypt, like Tim said, and a business opportunity to the vast majority of Cameroonians. Not yet. Because the reality is not the same.
Right. So you're saying that there's less industry, I guess, and more personal consumption of biomass. So it's just a very different environment. And you're saying that you're not seeing the stories then about the possibilities maybe that Tim was talking about.
No, you have it. You have it in Cameroon. You have some opportunities like it, but it's not something that everybody or the many people are doing it. No, it's not yet like that here.
Not yet mainstream then.
Yes.
Right. Samuel, from the Nigerian perspective, what are you seeing along this sort of this talk about opportunities versus the bad effects of climate change?
Yeah, I would really agree to the fact that a lot of things are actually happening around climate change. And at the same time, I can also say that, we have amazing people like individuals in local communities and also, youth entrepreneurs who are coming up with innovations to, actually solve climate, change issues. Yeah, just recently, I was opportune to tell a story of a particular platform here in Nigeria. And what they do basically is that they are actually, building, a platform to reduce the rate of food wastage here in Nigeria. Yeah, because from the point of getting food from the farmer, like from the farm, down to the consumers, a lot of food, have been wasted, and these guys are coming up with, solar cold storage innovation to actually preserve food and ensure that food insecurity is being reduced drastically. And a lot of things are actually happening, and people are actually contributing to solving these issues. Yeah, because we must not only focus on just telling the bad side of the story. Yeah, and there are also good narratives that that can be told, yeah, of what people are doing to to ensure that they solve the issue of climate change in Nigeria and also in Africa generally.
Yeah, I like what you just said. So it's not just focusing on the bad or the negative side of the story. And I think, Tim, you started us off with this idea that there's a whole other environment of innovation around it that could come out of the continent that maybe doesn't get the same play, or maybe it's getting more play in Egypt. When it comes to reporting for other countries, it's still not front and center. And I'm wondering, let me go to you, Tim. I'm wondering how, as a foreign journalist, right, who's stationed in Cairo, unless I'm assuming wrongly, how do you see your position? We started off talking a little bit about these narratives that kind of get repeated and repeated about the continent, about who's going to suffer, with suffer being the operative word there, as opposed to what you just said, which is, innovation. I mean, just from a personal level, how do you think about what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I try to be very sensitive about really identifying in climate stories root causes of challenges that people are facing. And I don't want every article that I write to be something very stereotypical or this sort of conventional narrative of here in Egypt, for example, focusing all the time on like smallholder farmers who are kind of affected by climate change. And I mean, there's more to the story than that. But at the same time, I also want to respect the fact that these people are actually still living on the front lines of climate change, and they contribute a lot to the Egyptian economy and represent a very large portion of the population. So the issues that are relevant to them are very important to continue talking about, even if they are a little bit more conventional or what people sort of expect. So I don't want to ignore those kinds of stories, but I try really hard to look for, examples of innovation, as we were talking about, and looking at more holistically at, so I mentioned tech. That's an important piece of the climate ecosystem here. Egypt also has a very large share of large-scale commercial farmers, for example, who are doing, fruits and other stuff for export, and they are very much affected by climate change. So again, this is a kind of story that has larger implications beyond just the sort of the sort of poorest people who are most vulnerable in their livelihoods. There's kind of more pieces of the ecosystem than that. And I also try in my reporting to be very careful about attributing different negative impacts to climate change. Sometimes there are effects that people experience that are directly related to climate change, whether it's heat waves, droughts, sea level rise, and saltwater intrusion, for example. But in a lot of cases, in a place like Egypt, for example, some of the negative effects that people experience in the agriculture sector are not really about climate change. They're more related to governance and local pollution or poor infrastructure, bad investment decisions at different levels of the private sector or public sector. And I think it's important to be careful about, what are people really experiencing and what is the actual cause of that? Because I think there's a risk if we just blame every bad thing that's happening to anyone on climate change, then there's a risk of pushing the ball of responsibility into, exclusively into the court of the US or European countries or China that are the biggest carbon emitters. And of course, it's true, obviously, that they are the biggest emitters and hold the responsibility for climate change. But that's not to say that there's not still a share of responsibility that exists for governments in Africa for managing other aspects of this problem, water management or infrastructure or other issues, and how they kind of address those. I think just want to be. I try to be careful about making those attributions.
And I think that's an interesting point, Tim, because I want to jump in and go to Samuel here with that same question, because I read an article recently that was speaking about why there's often a lot of flooding around this time of the year in Nigeria, and it has to do, actually, this is both for Samuel and Josiane, with a long-standing agreement between Nigeria and Cameroon about dams and water usage. So there were supposed to be 2 dams built on the Niger River. There was only 1 built, and in Cameroon, Nigeria didn't build it. And as a result, when Cameroon lets the dam open, there's often flooding in Nigeria. Does that, Samuel, have you, and Josiane, is this something that's come up, and does that come up in the complexity of your reporting on climate change?
Yeah, I would say yes, it does. Like Tim said, most of these issues at times, is always connected to the government. Yeah, because I was trying to dig deep into the whole flooding issue that is happening in another part of Nigeria, and also trying to link it with the connection to Cameroon. And I got to realize that it's just as a result of the government negligence. Yeah, that a lot of people are being affected by flooding, like houses are submerged in water, markets are closed. Students can no longer go to school, just because of, flooding that is actually happening to them. So, had it been the government had actually, taking action to actually prevent this from, occurring, it would have been a different story entirely, and people would not have found themselves, in this kind of mess that has actually happened. So oftentimes, I noticed that, the government, also, have, an huge role to play, in the whole issue, of climate change, because, the government has to do what is right to ensure that, there is actually, mitigation, and they also need to take, climate action to ensure that, the effect, of climate change, is drastically reduced, in a society.
Yeah, Josiane, let me turn to you because you're also reporting, and I guess all three of you are reporting in environments where, and this is in general, I think, around the world, but where there's a hostility to journalists in general sometimes. And Josiane, I'm wondering, like, have you experienced what's your experience in terms of covering government responsibility in some of the issues around climate, that is local responsibility?
I would say that for now, I didn't cover this part of story, but in Cameroon you have it because, like Samuel and Tim say, sometimes the responsibility of the government, they didn't breed the breed, they didn't do many things, and the population are facing the consequences. But personally, for now, I did not cover this side of story. No.
Yeah. And Josiane, let me stay with you here and ask, as a journalist based in Cameroon, you also write for some international publications. Do you feel pressure from some of these publications to produce certain kinds of stories, or is it more open than that?
I think every media has his editorial line. In French, we say ligne éditoriale, and they write for their audience. And they want you, sometimes when you, like, I don't know for the other, but like me, you have to make some proposition. I want to work on this, I want to work on that. And they are the one who can say, yes, you can work on this, who validates your topic. I cannot say, I don't know if it's a pressure, but they are the one who decides. When you make proposition, they are the one who say, yes, you can do this, yes, you can do that. But you have it in every media, even in Cameroon. You make proposition, and because I used to work in Cameroon, you make proposition to your editor-in-chief, and you decide if you can go on the field to do it or not.
So there's an editorial direction that really might drive these stories, and I'm sensing there may be a tension at points between, if you're writing freelance for outside publications, for publications in Europe or the United States, versus a viewpoint that's more local, Cameroonian, Nigerian, Mozambican, let's say. But Tim, you had a point that you wanted to make to something that Samuel and Josiane were saying. So let me turn back to you. Tim? I think we might have lost Tim for a second. So let me, while we're waiting for Tim to just come back, Samuel, do you want to also see if you take that question, which is, what's your feeling about the way that you interact with newspapers, media platforms outside, and do they push a particular preference for certain kinds of stories, or do you have the freedom, or do you have any tension there in terms of how you report and what you report on? And then we'll go back to Tim once he's back online. But Samuel, to you.
Yeah, I think I need to be very sincere in answering this question, because based on my experience with dealing with international media outlets, I've noticed that they are no longer interested in talking about the problem alone. Yeah, they are interested in in telling stories around solutions and innovation to actually solve some of these problem that has been posed as a result of climate change here in Africa. So that's how it is at the moment. I must be sincere with that. So it's no longer like before, where they are only interested in just the bad narrative side of the story, but now they are so much interested in in solution, yeah, and also in innovation, around climate change.
Do you find that there's space for you to assign blame?
What do you say?
I was asking if you find that there's space for you to assign blame and culpability in causing some of the issues around climate change.
Yes, if there is a need to do that, there's a space for that. Yeah, I always do that. Yeah, because even when you're telling a story, around climate solution, also you need to look at some of the challenges also facing the innovation, and you need to look at consider some other things. And
oh, I think we might have lost Samuel. We're connection issues. But Tim, you wanted to make a point earlier around the I think it was the angles in terms of who is responsible, how you talk about government responsibility in both solutions and also challenges.
Yes, I just wanted to kind of add that in terms of what it's like covering these issues here, and the level of access that we have, or support or interference that's run by the government. There are a lot of challenges to working as a reporter in Egypt. We have certain, or I should say, I have certain advantages in being a foreigner here, to the extent that there's a little bit less oversight or risk of prosecution, to be completely honest, when you work as a foreigner, foreign journalist in this country, relative to my colleagues and peers who are Egyptian journalists working here. I think have to be even much more careful than I do about what they say. And I've experienced recently, just some of the complications that can come with just getting permission to visit certain areas. There's so much bureaucracy, and you need to get so many letters of permission just to go to a farm or to go to the coastline or anything. It's not easy to access certain places that really should just be public areas that people can visit. And I wanted to just add as well that this is more of a big picture issue, but one thing that makes it a little bit challenging is that this is a country that doesn't have a very robust civil society for a lot of reasons. And so there's a kind of deficit, I think, of independent researchers or activists who are well informed on the issues of climate change or any other important social issue, who feel that they can publish their own research on this, or speak to the media and act as sources, act as a link between journalists and characters or sources living on the front line of the issue. And typically, when you're reporting on climate issues, we rely a lot on civil society groups and nonprofits to help us understand the issue and connect us to experts and to be quoted in our articles as experts. And that's one thing that there is a deficit of in Egypt, at least, relative to the scale of the problem. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But just to add that that's one thing that makes reporting on this a little bit more difficult here.
So, I guess what you're talking about, and I love that you guys are all up. So there's a complex interaction between your space as journalists and, of course, the political space. And there's a tension between being able to hold folks to account around this, both internationally and domestically in the countries that you operate in, but also to, realize that you're in many ways reliant on those same people for information, right? So there's a dilemma here. I mean, I guess it's nothing new for you guys as journalists, but at the same time, I think it makes it really interesting for those of us who are reading what you're writing to understand some of the nuts and bolts or the soup that you guys are in as you try to put these articles together and inform us as the general public. I want to quickly, on that note, maybe switch a little bit from government, which we've talked about, but also to, this idea of, is there any, how are you talking about local businesses? Tim, you mentioned it from the innovation space, but, Josiane, let me ask you, like, how are you talking about local businesses and their thoughts about climate change, or their feelings about what they need to do in Cameroon to help mitigate some of the effects of climate change? Business leaders, small business folks.
I did many story about this small business story, small business. When you say how do we talk about? Can you precise what do you mean by that? Because we just talk about me for example. I talk about what they are doing, how they are fighting climate change. Firstly, sure, I'll talk about their initiative, what they are doing, and behind it, how they are fighting against climate change.
So it's really from that angle, there is a lot of awareness, it sounds like you're saying, in the business community, and a desire to tell those stories about what folks are doing for their own environment. Is that right?
Yes. Sometimes, cool. Yes.
Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And Samuel, from the Nigerian perspective with business leaders, I mean, I've had a couple of conversations with Nigerian business leaders. Doesn't necessarily seem to be top of mind, but then I'm not covering this beat. So what are you seeing? We might have lost Samuel in terms of our...
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, so from what I'm seeing here in Nigeria, I think some small businesses are actually, coming up with also, innovations on how to, solve some issues. Yeah, even locally. Yeah, because when you consider the issue of climate change, it means different things for different communities. Yeah, because different communities, as their own, climate issues that they are going through. Some, it might be energy crisis, some, it might be food insecurity, some, it might be, it might be anything, that relates to climate change. And, it all depends on how, people are being innovative, to come up with, solutions to actually, solve some of these problems, especially some businesses who are now looking into also contributing to solving, some of these, problems that has been posed by climate change, in the society.
Let me just, Sam, I want to press you before we talk a little bit about COP, and then I'll take questions from the audience. But Nigeria is a country that makes a significant amount of its GDP from the production of fossil fuel. How do you tell stories about this? But on the same token, Nigeria is not necessarily a country that contributes that much to greenhouse gas emissions. How do you handle that contradiction? I mean, we've seen it where, it's the whole world, for a little bit, at least before the energy crisis in Europe, was talking about how we shouldn't finance, fossil fuel projects, whether it's natural gas or oil in other countries. And now that seems to have either at least gone out the window for Europe as they deal with their own energy situations. But how do you deal with a country that both makes its money off of selling fossil fuels, but also is profoundly impacted by climate change?
For Nigeria to transition into a carbon neutral economy, it's going to take time. Yeah, because like you said, Nigeria solely depend on fossil fuel, as a source of revenue, I don't know if you're familiar that recently the Nigerian government launched its energy transition plan, and based on what the vice president said, Yemi Osinbajo, he said the ETP is going to be anchored on gas as a transition fuel. So what that means is that the government is not totally doing away without fossil fuel, because the government is looking towards the angle of using natural gas as energy transition. And this is what in international space there have been a lot of debate concerning also using natural gas, which it is believed that it also contributes to carbon emission in the society. But the government is more looking, at, an holistic view, of these, in the sense that, they're trying to, divert attention into renewable energy. Just recently also, I think about last year or thereabouts, the government also, made a vision of 30 vision for renewable energy, to ensure that, a large chunk of, our energy generation also comes from renewable energy, to ensure that, a lot of people have access to electricity, via renewable energy. And this is what is actually happening. But on the sincere note, it's not going to be easy for the Nigerian government to do away without fossil fuel, because it is contributing a whole lot, to the economy of the country. It's not going to be an easy thing at all. I was in Berlin, was it early this year, with the minister of energy, and he said, it's not going to be an easy thing for Nigeria to just say we want to stop using our fossil fuel, because they believe we're actually blessed with it. It's actually something that is natural, and we are blessed with it, and we should use it to develop our country and all.
So that's the sentiment that you as a journalist are picking up, and that's finding its way into your stories.
What did you say?
I was saying that's the sentiment that you as a journalist are picking up, and that's also one of the things that's driving your stories.
Yes.
Cool. Tim, let me ask you, because you're in Egypt. We know that COP is about to happen in a little under a month. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of access for journalists. You mentioned a little bit about sometimes it being easier for you as a foreign journalist in Egypt. What are you seeing in terms of access and from the wider continents, journalists from other African countries that might want to write about the negotiations that are sure to be raucous and pretty eventful there this time around?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit hard to say in advance what everything is going to ultimately look like. I mean, it's already been pretty clear that in spite of the Egyptian presidency, the COP presidency, saying numerous times that they want this to be the most inclusive COP ever, that's a phrase that they use a lot. I mean, just look, the hotel room costs are crazy. I was in Glasgow last year, and it was also fairly expensive, but I mean, now you're seeing, hotel rooms for thousands of dollars a night, and it's like, accessing Sharm el-Sheikh is not very easy, and so I don't know who will be able to come or be able to afford to come, and I don't know. I think that I'm expecting to have a lot of long security lines and various other logistical complications along the way as part of this. So I really don't know what it will be like. I'm sure it's not going to be completely seamless, but I also have some level of confidence in the government here to pull off events like this. They do big events like this in Sharm el-Sheikh pretty regularly, so I think they have a system worked out. So I'm not very sure, and I think that anyone who is interested in attending definitely by now needs to have that plan figured out, because we're down to the wire for it. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of see what the logistics end up looking like for it.
Great, yeah.
And how much gets accomplished.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that, you can only, your reporting is only as good as your access in many situations. And I think that access becomes a real issue for a lot of African journalists. Let me take some questions now from folks who are in the audience. I have one here from someone who's attending from Southern Africa, really asking about indigenous solutions. And let me turn to you, Josiane, because you talked a little bit or touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but indigenous solutions to some of the climate issues, and how do we include that wisdom in the climate conversation? For example, you said, what are Cameroonian small businesses doing? What are Cameroonian farmers doing that maybe doesn't get reported on or gets dismissed? How do you think about that, Josiane?
Can you repeat your question, please?
So I'm just asking about the importance of telling stories about indigenous wisdom and indigenous actions, from local knowledge, from historical local knowledge, to deal with some of the climate issues that we're facing.
In Cameroon, deforestation mostly affects indigenous population because they are living in the forest. They are the first person who face consequences of the deforestation. And for me, to cover it, we need to give them, to talk to them. When I say talking to them, it means going where they are and meet them and talk about their story, because we talk about the responsibility of the government in this area. The government didn't care, I cannot say care, but the government are not doing so much for them, and they're like they just have NGO, because NGO are helping them a lot. Many NGO come, help them and go, some come back, but they don't have in French, I would say, I don't know if someone can translate ça, je dirais en français, ils n'ont pas vraiment l'opportunité de mettre leurs problèmes sur la table, de parler avec les décideurs, les personnes qui pourront vraiment les aider à résoudre ce problème.
So let me just give that translation. I think essentially what you're saying is they don't really have the opportunity to speak with the real decision makers, right?
Yes.
And their thoughts out there.
Yes.
Right. And so that, again, we get back to this issue, which I think, each of you have talked about on access, which I think is something that we really need to be very clear about in terms of the conversation that journalists are having. It's not just about the stories you write. It's you have the access to tell those stories to the right people. And then, Tim, I think you brought it up as well. Like, what's your...
But that is another problem, because we have the language barrier. We also have it because indigenous people, sometimes they don't speak French, they don't speak English. And when you can say, yes, as a journalist, you need a translator who can help you on the ground. But when you publish the story, they don't have access to your story, because they can use it maybe to do what we say lobbying, to mobilize others, to fight for something. But when we write our story, we just publish them. Sometimes they don't even have a network. They can't read your story online. That is another problem for these people.
I think that's a big one to really address.
Yes.
Language access, it's internet access. It brings us back to these questions of equity, which I think are central to any discussion around climate, and speaking about climate, let alone acting on some of the issues that we face. Really quickly, I'm going to turn to Samuel for a quick shot question on diaspora, which is, how can we engage the diaspora? Since you report between two places, how do you think about engaging the diaspora, and how can the diaspora have more of an impact on the discussions around climate and the reporting around climate?
Yeah, I think the diaspora can also contribute to the public discourse of climate change. For a while now, I've been working with a Nigerian who is in Germany, and he has been contributing a lot to my climate reportage here in Nigeria. Yeah, because he seems to contribute his own expert view and opinion on topics around energy transition, and climate change here in Nigeria. So I think in terms of resource person, they can also be they can be of help, and also they can also help to come up with policies, and formulate policies and innovations that can actually help to solve some of the climate change issues that we're facing here in Africa.
Great. So I think that's an interesting point of departure in terms of where diaspora can come in, and something that we at the Africa Center think about a lot. But we have 2 minutes left. I know people have hard stops, and we're really grateful to everyone for joining us. So before we close, let me just ask, starting with Tim, hopeful not hopeful about the way that we talk about climate and the changes you see?
Oh, I'm hopeful. I try to remain hopeful. I think that the more attention that gets put on this issue, the better off we're all going to be. So I feel, I mean, there's still going to be some suffering ahead and impacts in the future, but I think more and more people are, you know, seeing opportunities in the solutions and understanding the issue. So I do have a sense of hope around this.
All right, thank you very much, Tim. Samuel, hopeful, not hopeful?
Yeah, I'm also hopeful, yeah, because, you know, I believe, you know, with time, things are going to get better. And we also, we don't need to sit down, we just need to take action to ensure that, you know, we solve some of these issues that, you know, we're facing in our continent.
And Josiane, you have the last word. Hopeful, not hopeful?
I'm hopeful. I'm very optimistic because, as I said, I see more and more journalists and people around me who are interested in this issue. I'm very, very optimistic.
All right, well, you heard it. There's a lot of optimism from our journalists, friends, and experts here. And to all of you, I hope that you also remain optimistic about the situation, especially raising awareness, reading the articles, and making sure those who need access to them can get them. Some of the things that we've learned here in our discussion with expert journalists around reporting on climate in Africa. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you in the audience. I really want to thank the Energy for Growth Hub as well, our partners in this. Just follow us on social media, at the Africa Center. Follow the Energy for Growth Hub at the Energy for Growth, or sorry, at Energy for Growth. Just stay in touch with us and stay tuned, because we'll have more programs here on climate and other issues around energy with our partners and our friends at the Energy for Growth Hub, bringing you some of the most interesting discussions about where we think the continent and, you know, for that matter, the wider world is going. Thanks to everybody, and y'all have good afternoons, good evenings. And, you know, if you're watching from someplace where it's morning, I hope you have a great day.
It's the sounds that move us, the stories that shape us, and the flavors that heal us. It's the communities that connect us, the ones that hold us down, the ones that raise us up. Home is a feeling we all know. So if you're looking for it, you can always find it here. The Africa Center. Home is here.
All right, I have to hop off. I just want to say thank you to everybody.
Thanks, Uzo. We'll talk soon.
Cool. See you a bit later today.